Welcome to the In Pursuit podcast from Pathfinder. My name is Dion Garrett, and this podcast is all about helping people who, like me, are in pursuit of a whole life, who want more for life, more out of life than what you just get by stumbling through life. That's what this is about. And it's from an integrated perspective of what God wants for us in the whole life that he has in mind for us. And today I'm here with my friend Brian. Brian is a theologian. Call yourself that, right?
I have a degree, so I guess I qualify.
Yeah. I mean, when we were in seminary, overlapping, I think, for a few years. They would tell us we were theologians.
That's
we were
right.
there not just to,
Yeah.
we were there to be theologians. Mm-hmm. So a theologian and a coach and an educator and father and so many other things. But one of the things that we have in common, some of those things are also things we have in common. One of those things we have in common is we're a couple of guys who I think have, gnarly pasts or journeys with the subject of shame, and have found a lot of help in diving into the topic and learning more about what shame is and how to heal from it and grow beyond it. So that's what we're gonna discuss today. Brian had, it was maybe 6 or 8 months ago, you sent me a link to a book, and the book's called The Soul of Shame. By Curt Thompson. He's a psychiatrist out in DC area?
I think he's Northern Virginia.
Yeah. And said, hey, I think you sent me another book first, and you're like, hey, this is a really great book. You should read it. And then after that, you said, no, never mind. If you're going to read something, read this book. This book is awesome. And you sent me this book, and I was like, I put it on my Amazon list where I kind of just keep some things like, I'm going to read that someday. And then you double backed, you came back, whatever the phrase is, recently, and you're like, hey, I don't know if you've read that book, but how many times have you read it?
3 or 4. Yeah. And I was reading it for we were heading down to Louisiana, and lots of good book time, and was listening to it and thought of you and just wanted to bring it back up and say, I don't know if you got a chance to read this, but I think you'd really, really like it. So,
yeah. And so I was like, okay, sometimes I'll get excited about a book, and then after a few months, I'm excited about another book.
Yeah, sure.
For the fact that it wore so well for you, and months later you're saying this is a great book, and Dion, I think this could be a helpful book for you. I think I ordered it that day and dove into it after Christmas, and have just been devouring the book. And I think shortly into it, you and I had another conversation about having just like, hey, let's get together and talk about this book. Let's book club it. Let's share a little bit about what we're learning and some of the insight we're gleaning from it. And then I was like, as I got into this book, I'm like, this needs to be a broader discussion, because I think the issue of shame, we all know that word, but the issue of shame and how it affects us and how insidious it is and how it's at work in every person's life, in every family, in every community, in every institution. It is the great sleeper of we don't realize how pervasive it is.
Yep.
And so, today I hope we'll talk a little bit about this book and just talk about shame, and I hope help people grow beyond, or at least even for starters, just begin to recognize all the places that shame's actually at work. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So for me, I don't know about you, the first time I became acquainted, that word shame or ashamed, like that's just a word in the vernacular, but as like a concept, my first introduction to shame was through my undergrad studies in sociology. And in sociology, shame's actually, just looked at purely for the benefit that it provides for holding societies together and preserving mores. And so like shame is kind of like this uncomfortable thing in sociology, but it's necessary to make sure that people act right and to make sure that rules are obeyed. And so it's kind of this tool that societies have to use in order to stay together, that without shame, it's really hard to keep people on track. And so my ideas of shame were always like, yeah, it feels bad, but it's pretty necessary to make life work and to make society work and make community work. And then fast forward 15 years or more to the work of Brene Brown, who then started to talk about shame in a different way. And really, for me, even theologically, started making me question some of the underpinnings of how I understood humanity's relationship with God. That kind of put me on this new trajectory of shame. I'm curious for you, just kind of what was your introduction to the subject of shame beyond just the feeling of it?
Yeah, I had yes, around COVID, really started asking those same questions. I think about what was motivating me in life, and I think the way you put it about it kind of being there but not being aware of it. I began to start questioning some aspects of it, and I had some friends who were also interested in that, and we read and we still read. We meet once a week and we talk about Brene Brown's The Soul of Shame book, and it is amazing how much it does drive life. And I think talking about your experience previously, I remember very clearly in high school being in a wrestling practice, and this shows up big in sports. There was a sign on the wall that said "Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda" gang, and it was these three guys, and they were, I could have done this, I should have done this, I would have done this, but it was basically don't make excuses and work your hardest every time. So I really digested that, and it was always, the motive was, and I remember being coached too. It was almost like in the 80s and 90s, there was a sense of like, what the most motivating factor is that you're not good enough.
Yeah.
And I'm not good enough. Oh, I'm going to show you. Let's go. And that was a huge motivator for me. And even with anything that I was trying to excel in, that was the motivator. I mean, even Greek at the seminary, it was really tough for me. And I remember I passed that Gibbs summer Greek, and I felt it wasn't this, hey, I did a good job learning Greek. It was, yeah, what's up now, man? I got it. You know what I mean? It was. So the whole mentality was constantly trying to prove myself, and everything I was doing was centered around that in some way, form, or fashion. And I didn't realize that.
Yes.
And I came to the realization that a lot of what motivated me was this core belief that I wasn't good enough and that I wasn't lovable. And that part of that came up in therapy as well when I started going to therapy. And so that's what really brought this topic to the forefront for me, was it really does it that works with things like sports and stuff like that, but even then it's not the best motivator. And as a coach, I've transitioned from how I work with athletes from that kind of mentality to trying to create an environment where they can fail and feel safe doing that. We're learning to grow together and all that, instead of this, you got to work harder kind of mentality.
Yeah. I think that's what's tricky about it initially when you hear that. And I think of the Saturday Night Live sketch way back in the 80s or 90s I think it was Stuart Smalley or something. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, doggone it, people like me.
Exactly.
And it was all like a big joke. And I mean, I laughed at it too, because it felt like, you could be that, you could be self-affirming, or you could be hungry, and you could improve, and you could go after stuff in life. And so for me, I didn't know self-motivation or even externally focused motivation in my life, apart from what I realize now are shame responses.
Yeah.
This either I'm not good enough, so I better work harder and try to prove myself to be good at something, or I think the other part of it is not just like I'm not good enough and I have to work harder, but the other part of it is like I'll never be good enough, and I need to act and pretend like I am, like I can't actually work myself there, but I can maybe hide. And then, I don't know, there are all these like tentacles of how it works. And I always assumed in my life, and I think the worst part for me of reading any book about shame, especially this one, is I think about my parenting way back when my kids were little, before I kind of learned some of this stuff. And so many of the things that I thought were key to me being a successful human were actually laden with all this shame motivation that I just was like, well, this is what they need if they're going to be successful. And as I was reading that, I had to kind of acknowledge that stuff and also just kind of think about my own journey too, because I was constantly thinking about like, I messed up my kids by
More shame.
right. And then it's like, oh gosh, I messed up my kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like the motivation part. And as a coach, you talk
absolutely.
about that. It almost seems like and I think especially for men, maybe for women, it's different. I don't know. But being raised male, I definitely feel like there is this culture that says the only way you're going to get better is if we, give you a little humiliation, give you a little shame. And for some people that's what it's going to take to make you hungry and drive you to.
Yeah. And I think the kicker behind that is your worth is what you accomplish. Your worth, there's a sense of, if going back to, I think the basis of shame being any message that says you're not good enough, or you're not lovable, or you're not enough, whatever it might be. I think you're right. I think our whole culture is built around that thought process, that idea. And the motivator then becomes, it's always, okay, you're not good enough, but then there's this like,
but you can never, once you believe that, right, you can never answer that.
Right.
Nothing matters. You can never answer that question.
Yeah.
You can get an Olympic medal, or you can
you're never
become we hear these stories in culture over and over again. Someone who's at the top of the heap and they still are like, doesn't matter.
Michael Jordan's a great example, right? Greatest of all time. And if you look at his Hall of Fame speech, it was supposed to be like a 5-minute real quick, thank you for this, thank you for that, et cetera, et cetera. But he started going around the crowd and talked about, I beat you. He had the guy who, he got cut from his team, that story.
Yeah.
The guy who got a spot instead of him was at his speech, and he was calling him out on it. He's like, look, I all that stuff. Yeah. So if a guy like Michael Jordan, who all the promises, he's still trying to prove, he still doesn't feel like he's good enough. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think that's why it's so subtle, is because it is so ingrained in our culture, and it works to some extent. All those times when I was wrestling, when I got to do another rep, I got to do this, I got to do that, I was successful in that mentality. But the problem is, it builds up the false self. What it does is we create this, or I do, I guess I should just speak for myself. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I know for myself, there was this persona that I always felt like I needed to project, and still do. This isn't something that, I got solved now, and because my worth, who I am, is tied so much to my worth, that I am not able to be vulnerable with people. So everything becomes a measure of my value and my worth. Mm-hmm. And so I fall into this one or the other thing, right? Falling off the horse one way or the other. Either and it can be something as simple as I have a parenting experience with my child, or an interaction with my wife, or whatever, anything. And I'll step back from it, and it'll either be, man, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have said this way, I should have done this way, and I'll feel terrible about myself. Or I will have done those things, and then I'll go, oh, I'm the best of all time. There's no healthy like just being, that just being isn't really there. Everything is either I'm either better than or less than. So I'm constantly, I can walk through the grocery store and do this. I can. It's such an embedded way, but it isolates me from knowing who I am in Christ, and B, being able to have intimate, vulnerable relationships with people, because I'm constantly trying to be this person that I think you want me to be, so that you don't reject me. And as long as that we're working with that, that's good. But I'm not getting what I actually need, which is that connection. So
and I think isolation is a key part that we'll talk about of the effects of shame. I still wonder I think for most of us, we don't understand. And I've been leaning into this for a while now. This book helped me kind of on a whole other level look at this again in my life, to see like how much and how many different facets shame shows up as a motivator. So I remember I mean, I shouldn't say I remember. This is still partially true. I've been a pastor for a little over 20 years. And I remember on my vicarage, my internship, I was at this church. It was a bigger church in the Twin Cities up in Minnesota. And they had like multiple worship services. And I was going there with the assumption that I would preach like once a month, maybe, which, when you're a seminarian, that's a lot. You're like, I got to write a message every month.
Yes.
And that was like, okay. And I knew it was a high expectations church and really gifted pastors. And then I showed up and one of the pastors was leaving. One of the pastors was already gone. It was like me and the senior pastor, and there were two worshiping communities in the same church. And the senior pastor looked at me and said, well, hey, Dion, you're welcome to preaching every week. And I remember just being like, what? And then I fell into this cycle of, as a 20, I don't know, what was I, 25 at the time, wondering like, what on earth am I going to say? I'm going to get up this weekend and what am I going to say? And I'm going to have nothing to say, and going through this whole gymnastics thing of, I'm going to get up and I'm going to have nothing to say, or I'm not going to get a message written in time. I'm going to get up and I'm going to say what I think is helpful, and they're going to boo me. Like I would go through these like nightmarish scenarios, and I would find myself being paralyzed. Like Friday night, I'd be working on my message all day. I've got nothing worth saying. At the time, I was married, and Jocelyn was working kind of an afternoon shift. And so I was like working into the evening, and I would have these emotional breakdowns where I'd just be like crying out to God and just like in tears of being like, I have nothing to say. And then I would hit this like tipping point where I think it was like, well, Sunday's coming, you better figure out something to say. And I'd write a message and I'd be like, trying to learn it, make it the best I could, white knuckling it all the way into Sunday morning. I'd get up and I'd preach, just being like, none of this is good enough. I don't have anything to say. I would get done and no one booed me. And and a few people actually said, wow, that was really helpful, or, thank you, or they would respond positively to it. And I would experience this euphoria of relief that was like a spiritual experience, because the agony that I was in was so strong that this relief of like, oh, I didn't suck this time. No one booed me. They didn't lead me out of town. They didn't, they didn't like walk away in disgust. Like, I would have these images of people just like, and in this church, in some churches, you have to go to the back and shake people's hands. And I still don't like to do that with people. Functionally, it doesn't work very well here, but to me, that was like, I used to call it the like line of shame, or the line of humiliation, where you have to shake everyone's hand and hear their comments about your message. And you just
get that about, yeah.
I couldn't do it. I would do it, but I was dying inside the whole time. And so then I would go into this, it would get over and I'd be like, whoa, I'm still in one piece. And I would have this euphoria and this relief. And it was like the highest high. And I would do that every week. And I would ride that roller coaster every week. And and so I started to learn to rely on that as like motivation. This, you have nothing to say. You're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to disappoint. People of God have shown up today to hear a message, and you have nothing to tell them. And this is their time to connect with God, and you are going to fail them. It was like this really heightened, but I think some of that was to get me over the procrastination I was feeling. It's probably causing the procrastination too. But it was like this agony I'd put myself through to get to the actual end result of delivering a message, and then the euphoria I'd feel afterwards when I wasn't a complete failure. And it was like I was addicted to that cycle.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, it definitely does. So what I hear you saying is that you were successful in that environment, and the means by which you were successful was this, low to low, high to high.
Yeah.
It just obviously, unhealthy roller coaster that you were riding.
That's the other part of it.
Yeah.
Right. And thanks for bringing that up, because that was the other part of it, is that even though whatever I was feeling, I was being externally praised for being, wow, what a gifted preacher.
Yeah.
What a gifted preacher. And so I'm hearing that and I'm like, okay, this is good. People think I'm gifted. This is going to be good for opportunities. It just feels good for my tortured ego. And I've got to keep this up.
Yeah.
And so the more they said, what a good preacher, I think the more internally I'm going, I barely got it together this week. Like, I'm not a good preacher, but I've got to keep this up, which just heightened the pressure. Like, it was just excruciating. And I say it was, I think I'm moving through this and I'm learning preaching is not as fun as it was for me then. I say fun because I don't have the euphoria after I get done with the message.
The
and I'm
rush,
like,
I'm
I'm done.
Yeah.
It was, like that was the only fun part. The rest of it was torture, but it's less torturous now because I'm learning as I get up now or I'm writing a message. I really have gotten to the point, and I'm not exactly sure how I've gotten there, and maybe we can talk through this. I've gotten to the point where I'm not giving myself the doom and gloom talk. Like I have a little more confidence that God has something for me to say that some people are really going to value. Some people are going to be bored and be thinking about what they're doing later in the day. That's not really about me. But I've got something to say and it's going to help some people and I'm going to do the best I can. And I've just kind of come to this more grounded approach to preaching, which hasn't made me apathetic. It's just made me the process less of
a little more mature.
Psycho roller coaster that I was on for so long.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think that, actually what you're describing is I can relate to that as a teacher. When I first started teaching, it was a lot of ups and downs, and coaching still the same thing. But, I think that that's initially, a big part of shame is fear.
Yeah.
A fear of failure, right? And it goes back to that fear of not being good enough. And that is a huge motivator, right? And I think when you're doing something new and you're on stage and it has value and it is important and there'll be felt consequences if you're not successful.
That's where
that kicks in. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It is.
Yeah, that really sums it up.
Yeah, it does. And then as you do that more often, you get comfortable with it and it doesn't carry the same fear. So the shame piece isn't there the same way. So you kind of mature into that place,
Yeah. And when I was talking about, I don't know if this is before we started rolling or not, when I was talking about parenting, I think then the mistake I made was going, well, this is part of the formula that made me successful.
Oh God.
So then as a parent, I'm going, well, I have to do this to my kids.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. Exactly.
They've got a presentation and they're procrastinating. And I'm going, hey, you know what it's going to be like if you get up there and you have nothing to say? Do you know how embarrassing that's going to be? Like, oh my gosh. And because that's what I used. That's the tool that I found helpful at the time. I didn't have any other tools. And I passed it on to my kids. Luckily, my wife is a little different. So she kind of counterbalanced that. And then over time with my kids, I started to learn like, oh wait, I think there are other ways to motivate.
Yeah.
And so I was really, really grateful for all of that. But you can see how just from a learned methodology, how shame can start to become this patterned thing that gets ingrained in families and systems and societies. In Kurt Thompson's book, though, he actually has, and this was really compelling to me, he actually gives a deeper definition to shame. I mean, in my recollection of it, which I should be able to remember really well because I just read it like a week ago, he says, I mean, almost like shame is the tool that evil uses, like the primary tool that evil uses. And the reason we can't get rid of shame, no matter how many books he or Brene Brown or anyone else writes, is because it is the primary tool of evil to, I think he talks about like disrupting the joy of creativity. That was kind of a new thought for me, that shame is not like in this list of maladies that we have to deal with, but it is the primary tool of the evil one to take away the life and the wholeness that God created us for. Yeah.
And that's what really, so he really brings a lot of different things and ties a lot of different things together in the book. He hits a lot of different stuff, and from the theological aspect, psychological aspect, the neurobiological aspect, the biblical aspect. He really does I think a good job of tying it together, and that's what really opened my eyes to this. Was he talks in there specifically about sin, or he says shame is the driver behind what we call sin.
Yeah.
And in that, I mean, I think he almost goes as far as to say, if we sin, it's from a place of shame is evolved from that. Yeah. And it's not, and then he goes into, I thought this was really interesting. He talks about the story in the garden, or the Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And he talks
Genesis
about
2,
how, you know, they were before they ate the fruit, they were both naked and they were not ashamed. And he
Right,
says,
which is the Bible intentionally says those words.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And he says, you know, the author could have said anything there. They were naked and they were warm. They felt strong.
They were
felt
happy. They felt
exactly.
joy. They felt, yeah.
He chose to use the word shame. And then he talks about what is the first thing that they do afterwards is the sin was not obeying God.
Yeah.
The felt response. And I think that's what shame is it's the felt response of this stuff. Their felt response was, I need to cover myself and then I need to hide, which are both very much shame responses. They felt shame. So when you talk about he talks about how God's intention for us is to integrate with one another. That's how that's what we desire. Like from a spiritual standpoint, from a neurobiological standpoint, from
Right,
just
if you know
a
anything
life
about
standpoint.
attachment stuff,
And that's exactly,
like
yes.
how important, and
Right.
we're learning that if like that integrated attachment relationship, that if you don't have that, you can have nutrition, you can have money, you can have,
You're
a,
done.
but a child is done.
Yeah. Right. And that's the big aha moment with shame is, and how it permeates everything is that it prevents us from doing what we're intended to do, which is to integrate with one another, kind of like what we're doing right now. And that can be just a conversation or a fundamental relationship or whatever it is. And Kurt Thompson would say that is our purpose, is to create beauty. Beautiful things are created when that happens, and shame stymies that. And it's so difficult to quantify because it permeates everything. You can have, I was trying to think of some scenarios. It can be the smallest thing. Like, when I get home tonight, my wife may say, hey, there's some crumbs on the floor, you whatever. And a healthy response to that would be, oh, thanks for pointing that out. I'll make sure I sweep that up. She's talked to me about that. That's an ongoing thing that everybody has, something like that, but shame says, oh, what I hear is, I've talked to you about this a bunch of times, and your son. So A, you're not parenting well, right? B, you're not doing what I asked you to do. Mm-hmm. And I hear I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
And then that can go to another place of I'm going to be abandoned.
Yeah.
And so my response to that, instead of having a loving, engaging response to her, is to be defensive. Oh, well, yeah, I asked you to clean up the stuff in the bedroom a bunch of times and you're not doing that. Well, that leads to an argument. Or to stonewall and isolate. I'm not good enough. She's just, whatever. This is just, and so that leads to depression. And that's shame. Yeah. That's exactly what that is. So it prevents me from having that healthy response and having a creating beauty, which is humility. Oh yeah, you know what? She's right. I needed to clean that up. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm going to make sure I keep a better eye on that or whatever. And it takes it to a place of isolation. And that's in it. And Dan, I think it's happening in every interaction people have just throughout their day. And like you said, we're just not aware of it. And that's why it's so helpful to become aware of what that is. And you're right with the attachment styles. I think it affects people more who've had that there's a really good book, Attached, that talks about this and the relationship we form with our primary caregivers from the age of 5 and how much that affects everything in our relationships down the road. If that's not healthy, it affects you even more, which means you have to do that much more work to get to a healthy place.
Yeah, that was interesting.
It's challenging.
Talking about
stuff.
The abandonment issue because I think that's a normal shame response of I fear for this relationship. Are you going to move away from me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for some of us, if we didn't have people, if we actually had people who in a shame moment or shaming moment did move away from us and we didn't feel like they moved back, it does feel more threatening than for others. And I'm kind of one of those people, I think, who deals with more abandonment stuff than some people might. I thought the other thing that he said that was really interesting, and this was the other, I was like, whoa, blown away. This guy's gets into the neuroscience and as a psychiatrist knows more about the brain intimately than I do. But one of the things he talks about is, shame, it separates, it disintegrates in relationships. So we see that in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve turn on each other. They hide from God. Like suddenly this relational fabric that was woven together, Adam and Eve, the two become one flesh, and God is walking with them, and they're in this beautiful community. They're blaming each other. They're hiding from each other. They're covering in the presence of each other. They're like, all of this is broken down. But then he starts talking about how, and I was fascinated by this, that shame actually causes in our neural whole, the parts of our brain, it causes disintegration in our brain. People who experience more shame, as I read this, have a more compartmentalized brain, a brain that doesn't communicate vertically and horizontally across right and left, and then the limbic system all the way up. Like it doesn't connect as well, which for me again was like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So disintegration is not just in the social sense, which again, social science is kind of my background, but this disintegration is actually happening within our minds, and our minds become less integrated. And so with a less integrated mind, that means less impulse control. That means I probably start to do things that later on I'm like, why on earth would I have done that? I was out of my mind when I did that. And you might be right that if you've experienced a lot of shame in your life, you might be out of your mind while you do that. But then what does that do? That heightens a sense of I'm a monster, more shame, which further disintegrates the brain. And so you're like, it's causing separation in relationships between people, relationship between people and God. And then it's doing this whole thing with our brains. And I've often had this experience, I don't know for you, where I'm feeling a sense of shame and I'm going through the steps and I can think my way through it, but I cannot get my feelings to catch up.
Yeah.
And I've had to, I've learned to do breath work and some other things that can help with that. But there's some times where I'm like, hey, in my mind, I know everything's okay. I am in a panic in this other part of my being. And I thought it was interesting that Kurt Thompson also talked about that, shame is always an embodied experience. We think about it as like a thoughtful, it like it's only a story. It is a story, but it's not only a story. It's an embodied experience.
Yeah, and I think
is that true for you too?
Yeah, oh for sure. And I think I what you were saying about it, I like that you brought up the fact that we tell ourselves stories, and that's how we know ourselves. That's how we know each other. It's another thing he talks about, and I think you're right. I think especially in my background, my parents were divorced when I was 5. My father wasn't in my life, as much. We wound up having a good relationship, but there was a long time there where there was a lot of messages that he wasn't sending intentionally that I picked up that said, I'm not lovable. And so I have to prove my worth. And that led to, sports and all that kind of stuff. But going to the disintegration part of it, because I don't have that background, I guess, it takes practice. I can, going back to the scenario with the kitchen, stuff not being cleaned up, I can cognitively get to a place where, everything's going to be fine, whatever. And the disintegration part of, if I sense that, if I hear you're not good enough, I don't use the parts of my brain that cause integration. I default to the parts of my brain that cause disintegration and distance. And I, respond in an unloving way. And it is it's so strange. It's a skill to be learned. Like you talked about, like you have to, I've done the same things whether it's a breathing exercise or whether it's going into a room and praying through a psalm or reading a psalm or just removing from and letting everything come back down. The good news is I don't know what your experience is. I've been doing this now for, I guess, intentionally for 2.5 years. I'm a much different person now than I was, then. So the good news is it is a place you can get to, but the tricky part is I found I can't just, my first thought is not useful. My first response is not useful. It just isn't, it takes getting past that, praying, whatever it is, and getting to a place where I'm able to have the response I desire, the integrated response, the loving response, then I know that's healthy. But that is definitely something that takes intentionality. It doesn't just happen, and I did kind of notice, it's interesting too, I went to Concordia, Wisconsin, and I was going to be a pastor, and a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends were people who grew up not in perfect homes or anything like that, but they grew up in homes where, both parents were there. It was a very stable environment. Everything was kind of like good. They, I kind of had a big conversion experience. They kind of grew up in the faith.
Yeah.
And they were amazing people. And I learned so much from them, but I always felt like there was something different from me to them. And I never really could put my finger on it. I never really understood what it was. And I think it's this. I think that like people who have that secure attachment style, shame doesn't affect them the same way as with somebody who maybe come from a background where there's trauma or there's something like that. And I've always found that interesting. So I think, if you have experienced that earlier in life or whenever, I don't, depending on who the person is, it has to be an intentional skill that's practiced. It's not just the shame response. You have to be aware of it and then practice the skills to have a healthy response.
Yeah. I just had one of those moments, I think it was last night, with my oldest daughter who's just graduated college and she's home right now. And we were talking, I think I incrementally became a better parent as time went on. And certainly as my kids got older, like I think we went through this golden time of where I was really dialed in, really good. But when they were little, I think I was dealing with a lot of stuff. Like I was just saying, when I'm going through this roller coaster every week on my vicarage, that's when Eliana, our daughter, was born. She was born into that. And it wasn't a war zone. It wasn't, but like I was in a lot of distress every week. And this is, piled on top of some stuff from just that I was carrying with me from my family story. And so she definitely got the worst of it. And so and I'm trying to do repair with her and just acknowledge some of that and acknowledge that as she's growing as a person, she needs that reality acknowledged. And it can't be about my shame, my shame will get in the way of me being the dad that I need to be to her now.
Yeah.
So she brought up, we were talking about some stuff and she brought up, I think I was admitting to some stuff. And then she said, yeah, and you were pretty explosive. And of course, like I'm owning some things, and that wasn't what I was owning at the time. I was owning some other stuff, and it felt like this piling on. And immediately, thank God I just, been reading this book because immediately it was just kind of this like, it was too much. It was like, hey, here I'm being open-hearted and I'm trying to tell you some ways that I messed up. And then you pile on. And it just was this like, and it was immediately the shame reaction. And I was able to, I just kind of was like, looked at her and I was like nodding. I took a breath. And one of the tips he gives here is he actually says use a 3x5 card. And every time you see shame operating, just make a tick mark to be like, that's shame. I know what that is. And you don't have to do anything else other than go, this is shame. So in that moment, I was just kind of like mentally did that. I took a breath and was like, this is shame. And if I yield to this right now, I'm going to further the injury that, I did a long time ago. And I just, was able to be like, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry about that. And then we had a further conversation of just about like, I love you. I've always loved you. I've tried to show up for you the best way that I can, but you're right. I was, and I'm trying to do better now. But it ended up being, I think, a pretty good moment. You'd have to ask her, but it was almost a disastrous moment because in this moment of trying to own something, she added something that just felt so threatening to me. Like, not only did you screw up in this way, Dad, but you screwed up in this way too. You're not enough. You're such a failure, which I know is not how she feels about me. But that was like this moment just, I think last night, where this whole shame mechanism had the chance to disintegrate. Yeah. So I'm trying to have a healing relationship with my daughter. And that could have been a moment where I denied her reality, further hurt her, or got mad for her being insensitive, right? And then we end up in a big fight and we go to separate corners of the house. And it's interesting to me just how true the disintegration, the descriptor of shame's the primary tool of evil in our world. Shame is the root of, all sin. And then it further drives us. Every sin drives us into further shame, which so it becomes this vicious cycle.
Compounds. Yeah.
And it accomplishes all this through disintegration. The more isolated I am from the people who I need the most, the more my brain parts and the community of, lobes and everything within my brain, the more isolated that community is, the more I'm going to do things that aren't healthy for me or whole or life-giving to others. And then, so for me, this also plays into theology. If we can go there, I don't know, because you're right. I had a similar experience. I went to a different Concordia Lutheran college. I went to the one in Ann Arbor, and I'd meet these guys who were just like, pretty well-adjusted families. And I immediately responded to their theology in a negative way because I found, and this was before I really knew all these concepts, but I basically found their conception of how they talked about God very cold and shaming. So it's like somewhere along the way, I think this was my draw to God, is that I sensed, I learned, probably some great Sunday school teachers, probably the presence of the Holy Spirit, but like I had this intuitive sense that even though my life was steeped in all these kind of shameful interactions and shame motivators, that God was different. Which then kind of got me into trouble with some of them because I think for a long time Christian theology has been, and I don't know how long, but has been steeped in this more of a shame story. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I definitely do, and I think you're, I think there's two things going on with that. In my experience is like one of the big things that drew me to, and when I went to Concordia, Wisconsin, they recruited me to wrestle and I wanted to be a pastor. And that's about all I knew about. I mean, when I became a Christian my junior year in high school, and I was running around with a Bible and talking to my friends, these people I knew, and it was like, hey man, do you have any problems here? There's this book called Psalms. You'll really like it. And I was really ignorant to everything. And as I started to learn about,
how did you go from being a convert in your junior year of high school to like, by college, like I want to go be a pastor? The Chosen, the first episode of The Chosen, Mary Magdalene's experience where the Nicodemus comes up to her and says, what did he do? What explain it to me? And she says, I was one way one moment, and the next way I was different. And it was at a White Cross, which I guess is a Christian metal band. I never heard them before or after, but I was coming out of a place in life where it was very dark, very, very, I was very disintegrated. I was very angry. I was very despondent. I was reading Nietzsche. I was there, and existential all over the place. And I went to that and I came forward at an altar call, and I was baptized as an infant and in that as well. But I came forward and I just knew two things: that God loved me and my sin was forgiven. And that was never going to change. And I tell you, from that moment in winter of 93 or 94, whatever it was, that has been true through everything else. And and I think what you're saying, my experience with that was, it was the first time I felt like I was worthy and I didn't have to earn it. Yeah.
That was that simple gospel message. And that has always been so transformative to me that how could I not give that away to somebody?
Yeah.
So that was kind of the mentality before, and then I pivoted in education. But going back to the theology piece of it, I think that what I really appreciated I read C.F.W. Walther's Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel. And when I was first a Christian, however you want to put it, I know there's theological stuff behind that, but my junior year when I encountered Christ, I didn't really get it. It was like, well, and I fell into this legalistic, I'm from West Michigan, a very reformed area.
From Michigan.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm over here getting emotional. I think. Just let me interrupt you.
Yeah,
please.
Please.
Why I'm getting emotional.
Yeah.
I think for me, I'm getting emotional because just what you described, like in this, C.S. Lewis talks about this too. It's just like this first love experience with God. When you meet him as he really is, he meets you really as he really is, and you discover him. I think I had no reason to understand. I don't know if I had a model for like a shame-free, just unconditionally accepting relationship. I didn't have it. And it's not even, and some people talk about who've got father issues about how it's hard to call God a father. And I can respect that and I can understand that. For me, in my story, God just kind of showed me something that I hadn't known before.
Yes. Very good.
And
yeah.
I felt like this, I experienced a different kind of, like I felt loved and accepted, and like I didn't have a model for that. It wasn't like, oh, this feels how it feels when I'm at grandma's house. Like, I don't think I knew it. It was a brand new thing, which to me is maybe further evidence that, like, at least in my story, that like this is real. Like I had no reason to know that. I had no reason to experience that other than something miraculously came into my life that was brand new for me, an intervention of true grace, true unconditional love, true delight, and that started to open up my mind to the possibility that love and relationship could look different.
Life is different.
So I think just you sharing your story, like, yeah, it just hit me and made me like so grateful, and just the power of God. And this is part of my calling into ministry, through a few points in my story, just seeing that God is this relentless pursuer of people.
Yes.
He's not freaked out by our, in Genesis, by our nakedness and by our sin, but he storms into the room and he says, "Hey, I'm here." And that had been my story, my family's story. And I felt like as I would hear even pastors or other Christians talk about God, they didn't talk about him in that way. They talked about him as a God that you needed to go find, a God who was easily offended, a God of, impeccable manners, who if you didn't do the things the right way, like, you're out of favor, go, leave the table. You've just embarrassed yourself and all the rest of us. Is kind of how I heard God talking. And that created this dissonance in my mind, but I felt like I was so anchored in this otherworldly, miraculous, supernatural. I call it supernatural because I'd never known a love like that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so
I just feel like I need to explain that. It's beautiful.
In that moment. But so tell me more about
and that's
you going off to college.
And I should add too. What followed that up right afterwards was a guy who I went to school with from elementary school onward, who I never talked to. Right around that same time, asked me if I wanted to go to youth group, and that was the first time, apart from that experience I had where I was just, because I had broken my leg playing football and my identity was who is all speaks to shame. The whole thing does. That's who my identity was. And when I broke my leg, I didn't know who I was. But I thought that everybody else around me had changed. And what I realize now is I was evaluating my worth to other people as how I was as an athlete. And when I couldn't do that, I had no idea who I was. So it left me in this void, this self-hate, a lot of self-hate, and then hate other people, and just angry kid.
Yeah.
And that encounter with Christ that night, my value is not in my performance. Mm-hmm. My value is in who Jesus Christ declares me to be. And that's when that's reflected in our relationships with one another, beauty occurs. And going back to shame wants to stop that. It just does. And so I went to that youth group from this guy who I didn't know, and it was the first time I felt unconditionally accepted by people. And just I want more of that. So let's go to college and let's give this to other people. But I think that's, I don't know. I think, I read C.F.W. Walther's Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel, and I understood law and gospel, and I understood the purposes of them. And that really helped me to understand theologically, academically, the differences between those two things. Because before it was, I'd wake up in the morning, this is in college, and I love God. I want to serve him better and honor him better. Well, how do you do that? Let's fall back to this old system of working hard and improving. Yeah. And it was, okay, I'm going to be nice to everybody I talk to today. And I go throughout my day. I was very sincere about this. And I go throughout my day and I do that. And I get home at night and I do the checklist. And I realize, well, I didn't do, oh God, I said that. Oh, wow. And then I felt shame. And then I didn't feel good enough again. And so I think anytime I guess I don't really have good words for it, but I think that it's kind of what I was just saying a minute ago. I am who I am in Christ. I am who he declares me to be. And that's when my worth and value shift to something else, as it will do throughout the day, depending on the thing, then I turn other things into idols. And those things become where my worth and value come from. And as soon as that happens, I set myself up again for that shame experience of being better than or less than. And so that's a big piece of that for me.
And as Christians, we talk about idols, things that kind of take the place of God in our life. And I think when we talk about those things and how God doesn't want us to have idols, I think we almost talk about those things as if God feels threatened. Like, hey, what are you doing? That's my place. How dare you? You can't. And I think it's more, again, from a non-shame perspective, because I think that's kind of a shame-informed perspective that, I put something in place and now God's mad at me and I'm in trouble. And I think from a non-shame perspective, what God's actually saying is, hey, if you rely on that thing, it is going to break your heart. Like, I love you too much. Like, let me give you something steady. If you make that the center of your life, it will absolutely disappoint you and it will break you. And I don't want that for you. So, root out that idol and, anchor your life on something more secure. Me, my love. And I love, again, The Soul of Shame, Kurt Thompson talks about, and this has been a long debated, this gets into Christology and things, but at the baptism of Jesus, the declaration of the Father, and I bring this up in a lot of baptisms here, but this is my son whom I love, with him I'm well pleased. The proclamation of the Father being the kind of anti-shame message, this message to Jesus of, hey, you're mine, I love you, I'm delighted with you. And if we had that message spoken over us every day, which we do by our Father in heaven, we just don't hear it, but like we would be able to be much more shame resistant and shame resilient when it comes upon us if we knew, hey, there's someone who unconditionally loves me, who delights in me, who's pleased with me. But I feel like often, even within our tribe, which is very grace oriented, I feel often that delight, that pleasure, that love feels a little too easy to lose, or the disapproval or the disappointment of God feels a little too quick to come in. At least that was my experience. And I think Kurt Thompson also talks about, I don't know exactly how he says it, but I remember this old fireman. He was like this old, I don't know how old he was. He seemed forever old. In my first church, he was like this old retired fire chief. And he made really clear to me, so often we talk about why did God send Jesus, and we give the answers because we were so sinful and we needed to be saved and our sin had become so great. And he said, no, the answer is because he loved me.
Yeah.
He loved me. Like, you can't explain him even wanting to come to atone for our sin or to do anything to rescue us if you don't start with just this love and delight. And I remember sitting there with him, and I'd already been through seminary, 8 years of theological schools, and just being like, I think it is that simple, and I think I have some rethinking to do. I've got some rethinking to do.
Yeah.
Because it is like, oh, he loves me. Love is his love for me, his delight for me is the foundation for all of his activity. And if I feel like there's some other motivation, like I'm missing it.
It's going back to the law piece. Yeah, I hear you. And I think he talks about, Kurt Thompson in the book talks about, and Brene Brown talks about this. And I think there's obviously the best example of this that we can be given is the antidote to shame is vulnerability.
Yeah,
and
And does Thompson talk about, I think he does talk about Jesus's, vulnerability on the cross, being, literally stripped naked.
Yes, he does.
And like, that's a very shaming event for most of us. And their
scorning
shame is
the shame.
Yeah. And he scorns the shame of that. He just kind of leans into the vulnerability of all of that because he knows he's one who's approved by the Father and loved by the Father and delighted in by the Father. And it didn't make it easy for him. It wasn't an easy moment, but he was able to scorn the shame of all of that because he was so rooted. And that like made me hungry to be like, my gosh, I'm not Jesus, but if I could have that kind of shame resistance and resilience in my life, just to be so rooted in who God calls me to be, or who has already said I am, not even calls me to be, because that's the wrong thing. Because I think that's where I get hung up. If I be the person that God wants me to be, then I would, but God's already spoken it. Like, it's already true. If I can just believe and accept that it's true, that I'm loved, he delights in me, that he's pleased with me, then it changes everything.
It does. And I think, so if that's the example, Christ on the cross, dying for us, ultimate vulnerability, this is God on a cross dying. I mean, it's and then rising again. What does that mean for us and how we live? And not from a work standpoint, not from a law standpoint, but you just in the course of our conversation offered a really good example of how powerful vulnerability is and how challenging it is to remain vulnerable when you're hearing shame messages. When you were talking about your discussion with your daughter, that's a beautiful example of you being vulnerable before her when she's telling you something that shame is screaming at you, right? To respond a different way and to show her God's love by allowing her to be seen. And he talks about that. His podcast is called Being Known. To be known, you allowed her to be known by you. And in doing so, you created beauty and I know I've had those conversations with my kids, and I'm sure I'll continue to have them. And I know how powerful that is. And I know how tough it is to listen to that, but also how healing it is for them and how powerful and the integration that occurs between, you and your daughter that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
And that's what shame doesn't want.
Right.
Right. And that makes it so profound and powerful because it is the linchpin on which love hinges. You have a choice to feel shame, be defensive, push back, or you have a choice to surrender your will to do that and love her and stay there in that uncomfortable place and remain vulnerable and let her say what she has to say. And beauty gets created. Integration happens.
Right.
When at that same moment, the opposite could have happened.
In that moment, like in a small way, I'm scorning the shame. I'm doing it. It's coming for me.
That's
and I'm
that
saying,
example.
No, you can't have this moment. You can't further damage this relationship. You can't further hurt this girl. Like we're moving forward in a healthy way. And
that's hope.
Yeah.
That's Christ working in your life. I mean, I really think that's, and that's the thing about shame is if there's all these things that happen throughout the day, thoughts, actions, moments that happen, then there's all these moments, actions, opportunities for us to love one another and for us to know Christ in our vulnerability by practicing vulnerability with others. And from every level of our being as people, from the neurobiological, the spiritual, any social psychological, to then be known by that person and to create that beauty that God intends for us. That is loving our neighbor, right? It's fine to lend them a cup of sugar if they need it. That's great. But it's another thing to be vulnerable with them and to integrate with them on that level. That's power. That's life. I think that's what gives it meaning. That's how profound and how important of a topic this is, shame versus vulnerability in living out the Christian faith. It's fundamental,
Yeah. When you talk about being known, in my mind, I'm just thinking about the first layer of being known, like someone knows you or knows all about you, but there's all the stuff that we hold back because if they knew, they would turn their face away. Yep. If they knew, they would walk away.
Yep.
And it sets like on one hand, I don't think I'd believe it was true if I hadn't experienced it in human relationships, first with God, but then in human relationships, which then make me believe it's even more possible with God. So it's this wonderfully, you see why we don't just need God, but why we need each other.
Yeah.
But I think for me to believe really that if someone knew everything about me and the stuff that I really work hard to keep hidden, that it was even possible that they would not turn away from me and abandon me. That seemed impossible. And I think for a lot of people that must seem impossible, like to go, who out there,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
My spouse, is picking at me because I've put on a few pounds or I'm looking older. And if they knew this stuff, like they would be out the door. Right. I feel like they're mad at me about the crumbs on the floor. If they knew this, they would never respect me or love me. They'd never be able to look at me the same. It seems like an impossible, I think it's a beautiful, ideal scenario. Like, wouldn't that be great if we could have someone like that? But at the same time to go like, but really?
Yeah.
Like that's not possible.
Yeah, I think, and I think you're right. I mean, there's Brene Brown talks about this all over YouTube too. There's a time and a place, and there's people who are worthy of hearing your vulnerability, and there's people who are not. This is where boundaries come in. And there's a whole other side to this where we want to do this in a healthy way. But I found what has been very powerful for me. We talked about how not reacting from a place of shame is a learned skill, right? We have to practice that. I have a group that I meet with where we actually read through Brene Brown's book, The Gift of Imperfection, and we within that group we're completely vulnerable with each other, and we understand that, and we it's hard to explain the mechanism behind that, but we share, hey, this last week this happened, and man, I really responded this way, et cetera, et cetera. It's a place to be known. Like they know, we know each other. We're known on that level, right? And then after that, I go right to another one that deals with marriage, but that group talks about how we're not talking about our spouses. We're talking about our responses to our spouses. And we read
which is a pretty different.
It's a whole different animal, right? Angle. And I'm very clear to my wife that that's what we're doing when we do that. But yeah, it's Keeping Your Love Line Honest, I think is the name of the book, which it also is a Christian book. But that too always sits in shame. Those reasons, same thing we've been talking about. Yeah. I don't respond lovingly to my wife primarily because I'm feeling shame. I'm hearing shame from what she's saying, whether she is or not. And so I practice it there in that group. And then I come to the best shame solution. I don't know that anybody can access during the week. And I go here, the church, and I hear once again the gospel, and I hear I've been a lot of different churches and stuff, that the way that the gospel's communicated here is beautiful. And if there's one element throughout the week that of any book I can read, of any interaction I can have, of any of that kind of stuff that allows me that prepares me to go and engage people in a vulnerable way and create beauty with them through integration, it's being known by Christ in my community with my fellow believers, right? That's kind of that's the battery, right? That's the power source. And so in answer to your question, I think it's very good. And I think there was even Doug preached a sermon here once about doing something similar, and finding somebody you can do that with. And I believe I find the best way to do that is, for me, that I've had the most success with, is finding a group of people, finding a book that talks about the topic, and practicing it with them, and being known and being seen by them. Kurt Thompson actually has, he I forget what the name of it is. I think it's the Being Known Institute or something, where he has groups of people and they just practice vulnerability, and they're some of the examples he gives, they're very vulnerable with one another, but just being in that place and doing that. So long-winded answer to your thing. I think it's a matter of cultivating, because if I'm used to, and I have a automatic practice of feeling shame, whether it's work and I feel pressures there or whatever it is, it's very powerful to get with a group of people where I can be known by them. We all have that intention going into it. And I found that to be very energizing, powerful, and educational. Maybe I can practice new behaviors, new patterns of behaviors. And then I bring that into my relationship with my wife, and I bring that into my relationship with my kids and my coworkers and all that kind of stuff. And that transformation starts to happen because I'm not so concerned about the false self. I want to learn how to practice vulnerability with other people and not practice shame, so that I can integrate with them in Christ.
Yeah. And when you say the false self, you're referring to what? Your projected?
Oh yeah. So not to
manicured image. Or
yeah. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
The pyramid that didn't exist. He never made a pyramid. And I was talking to somebody about that one night, and to self-actualize, that's almost like the self-actualization of the false self, right? The false self is anything I do to prevent feeling shame, or to make sure in my mind that you like me, And that's not me. That's not who, that's all shame behavior. So what does it look like for me to, in a safe way, be vulnerable with you? And it's not like you sit down with somebody and start sharing everything with them. It's the way you interact with them. And that has to do with, I think for me, the work I've done on practicing vulnerability more than it does the other person. I can bring that to the conversation, and there's a certain, I guess, energy there that, I don't know, that makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. And it's like, again, I'm a big fan of Brené Brown, and it's so helpful. I think if it's not rightly understood, vulnerability just becomes like another social value or something. It's like, oh, we should be vulnerable, like we should be kind. And there's not the understanding of like, so why? What does this do?
And
well, we just should be. We should be. And I don't think she says that, but I think that's how it's often understood. What you said about being known, I read it's a memoir. It's on like the New York Times bestseller called Group. And it's, I think it's called Group. It's about this woman's journey through group therapy. She's like a basket case. And then she gets in group therapy, and it's this quirkiest, craziest group ever. But it becomes really healing for her because it's the first time in her life where she's even in like all these different support groups, but like they're for different slices of her life. In this group therapy, she finally becomes like known as she is. And I think if there's anyone wondering, like, why would I practice vulnerability? It is because the reward of truly feeling known. And I don't think most of us have ever felt known, so we don't even know.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But the reward of feeling truly known, in spite of all the fear and the pain of exposing yourself or the risk you take to be vulnerable, to be known as you are, not your projected self or your false self, it's one of the deepest needs we have, but I think it's one of the most like set aside, or just like, I think we just kind of scratch it off. Like, I'll never be known as I am. No one could ever know me and love me as I am.
Yeah.
They could know me, but they wouldn't love me. They wouldn't stay in the room. They wouldn't stay in the circle, or they wouldn't stay in the marriage, or they wouldn't stay in the family. And unfortunately, like in life, there've been lots of examples of people who we disclose a little bit and they move away. And so we go, yeah, see,
not doing that again.
So I think that's what makes it so scary. But gosh, like, to live life not being known, or just to give up on the hope of that, I don't know if there's anything sadder. And yes, I mean, so God knows us as we are, and I think that's hard for us to get our minds around. I've actually been, since I read this book, just been doing work on that, of like imagining, like I've imagined God's face when I'm in some sin moment, or when he looks at the whole of my life, and I imagine him as being tolerant, being patient, like, okay, Dion, like, what's going on over there? Not flying off the handle, not losing his stuff on me. So I've watched him to be a God of restraint. Since I've read this book, I've just been imagining God's face in like my most shame-filled moments, of actually like coming toward me and saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." Like, even though you may have made this mess for yourself, like, my heart breaks for you right now. And that kind of compassion, that kind of, I think it's hard to imagine God giving that. It's hard for me to imagine God giving that to me, because I have experienced it, but in so few relationships. But the value of getting that, like, there's nothing more healing. So I'll be really clear, or somewhat clear. In my marriage, and I'm so blessed to be married to Jocelyn, because she continually surprises me as being one who can discover ugly things about me. And she's not always eager to like look for them. I don't think any of us are. We're kind of like, let me be blissfully ignorant about you, but when things have found their way to the surface, and maybe those are moments where I've just been, whatever. She has never, I mean, maybe temporarily, like, am I okay here? But she's never moved away from me. She's always come back towards me and always showed compassion. And that relationship makes me believe and know that it's
That's
possible.
Awesome. Yeah.
And I know not everyone has that. So I think about, you've got a group, I've got a wife. If people are at a deficit of, not every partner is like mine. I don't know that I'm reciprocally have been the same kind of partner to her, and I'm trying to be. So if you don't have a partner like that, or I've been at plenty of church men's groups where everyone just complains about their job the whole time, and
right.
it's just superficial. You're just like, oh my gosh, we're not talking about anything real, just grumble fest, and we do our lesson and then we move on. And I'm like, that's not the vulnerability I'm looking for. Like, what are you supposed to do? Do you go out and you find group therapy, like get some ground rules? I mean, maybe you know more about Kurt Thompson stuff. Does he have some structures to help people actually know how to set up a relationship or a dynamic or a group that
I think so with his, and it's something that meets. I haven't been able to be a part of it because I'm already got that kind of established.
Right. Yeah.
For myself. And I think I don't know. I think that's a question for every person to answer for themselves on what it is. For me, it was a realization I'm free. I'm free in Christ, and I want to know the fullness of that freedom.
Yeah.
But that's me. That's where I'm at. I think it starts with a realization of life's short. It is. Yeah. It really is short. And I think that there's I know I had, it just seemed like, have all this time. It just seems like life's just going to go on and et cetera, et cetera. And then you get to a point where you realize, that's not the case. And then you start to live and you start asking yourself questions that, about what your life is like and what it could be. And I think from that answer.
Yeah. I don't even know if people are, I know for me for a long time, I wasn't even into what could be.
Yeah. And I think it's a lot like, it really is a lot like a person walking their entire life with a broken leg and a broken arm and just not knowing that that's not normal.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this is so important, is because people are walking around with the assumption that a shame-driven life, that shame motivations are not only normal, but they're healthy, they're good, they're things that we should be doing. And they're not. They're the reality is that being motivated by a desire to be known by other people, to be fully present with somebody is I think the fullness of being a person. It's not how well I do at my job. It's not all these other things. Those are good. They're important, but they're not the point.
Yeah.
The point is the relationships we have with other people. And I think it starts with, starting with what is my relationship with Christ like? What does that look like? How do I live that out? And I think that's a starting place for being known,
Yeah. And I would say if you're still reading the Bible, like a lot of us have, if you're still like reading the Bible as this story of an angry God who's got you walking on eggshells, who it's like you're one strike away from getting the big punishment. I mean, this is how preachers have preached, not necessarily, but this is what drives altar calls. It's terrifying people of the fury and the wrath and the anger of a rageaholic God.
Exactly.
So you better clean up your act, and then God will accept you. If that's still like the reading that anyone might have of the scriptures, like you got to start over. And Genesis will take you there if you just kind of strip that from your mind. And Genesis will take you there, and you'll see a God who starts with love, who starts with a desire for relationship. I think it's really beautiful how Kurt Thompson in here talks about after Adam and Eve sin, and a lot of us know that story. Adam and Eve, they sin, they go and hide. God comes walking into the garden, and he says, "Where are you?" And how you hear that question probably says everything I need to know about your theology. You're like, what tone of voice is God using when he says, "Where are you?"
Yeah.
Is he saying it like when I walk into the house and I see that the dog is messed on the rug and I'm like, "Where are you?" And she's tail running. And for most of us, I think it's how we hear that.
Yeah.
Like, "Where are you?
Yeah.
You just messed everything up. Come on. Where are you? Come out of hiding." And the way Kurt Thompson talks about it here is I believe the true way that God came, that God it's not that he can't see them. It's not that he can't find them. It's a check-in. He knows what happened. He knows that they're hiding in shame. They're heartbroken. They're terrified. And, it's kind of like if you have a good partner who checks in with you sometimes and it's like, hey,
You good?
You good? Where are you right now?
Yeah.
Like, you don't seem okay. Where are you? Tell me about it. And so, again, I'm getting choked up about that. But you just watch God walking into this world that he, this scene that he graciously gave to Adam and Eve, and they reject him. Their sin is an utter rejection of God's place in their life and everything he gave them. And God, but he's not like coming to rub their nose in it, or he's not coming with a chip on his shoulder about it. He knows that their action has been catastrophic for them, for their relationship, yes, but ultimately for them. And he comes in with this like, hey, where are you right now? Let's come to me. Let's talk. And he pursues them. And so if in your reading of the Bible or the person of Jesus, if that's not the voice you're hearing, then you're missing it. You're missing it.
Amen.
And you just need to know the Bible doesn't make any sense. From Genesis to Revelation, it doesn't make any sense unless it just makes no logical sense unless you can understand the Father's disposition toward us with all that love and grace. And I confess on behalf of some bad sermons I've preached and lots of brothers and sisters in ministry who've gotten it wrong, that I've put my human shaming emotions as a father and as a boss and as a husband, I've projected those onto God, and I made him sound like me rather than reading the scriptures. So anyway, if I'm just thinking about people who might be reading the scriptures and they don't find much comfort, they just hear more judgment. That's an imposed voice. That's not the actual voice. If you can just kind of claw that stuff out and say no, and you can try on the different voice of God that you see in Genesis 3, I think that's a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah. I think conversely too, if you're a person who feels like you're unlovable, if your primary caregivers, the first people who were supposed to love you, didn't, and that's the message that you got, that you're not lovable, and then you go throughout your life and there's chaos and you're getting that message from other people, how can you begin to think that the God who created the universe could possibly love you?
Yeah.
And that's what the scriptures are demonstrating, is that no one has earned God's righteousness. It's a free gift.
Yeah.
And like you said, a lot of people never have that experience of being known by somebody, that free, unconditional gift of love. And it's life-changing.
Yeah.
It is. And it's offered to everybody, and it's beautiful, and
you and I have both had moments in our lives, and I've had multiple moments, but I've had, some kind of seminal moments in my life where, like, God, yes, through his word, but also just in a more direct way has imparted that on me, like just that sense. And so I'd just say, like, if you're a person who, just anyone out watching this or listening to this, if you're a person who feels like I didn't have that kind of caregiver, I don't know how I can believe in a God like that, or I don't know what that must be like, ask your Father in heaven to show you his love. Moses does it, like, show me your glory. But like, God, show me, help me see what I've not been able to see. Mm-hmm. And he'll do it on his time, because he's not our, he's not under our control. But I think God is longing to reveal his heart to people, and maybe just a little bit of openness and invitation to say, hey, show me what you're really like. I feel like that's a doorway he'd walk through.
Yeah.
Can we talk for a moment about church? In the book, Thompson talks about the power of communities, both to shame, and there was a line I underlined in here somewhere that, talks about how we deal with shame throughout the day, but when it comes from our community and there's like a chorus of shame voices, that like becomes intolerable. And I started to think about people who've encountered lots of church hurt. I know people who, I have a friend who became pregnant as a teenager out of wedlock, and the whole church and that years later, decades later, still carries, she's working through that, has worked through a lot of that, but that's still a wound. And we know that side of it, but Thompson also talks about how church and community, this is this institution that is supposed to be what you've talked about earlier. It should be the support group or the, you know, the group therapy thing that I read about.
Yeah.
Like it should be the place where we, and Thompson's just really honest about this, where we can be known exactly as we are in all of our messiness and have the love of Christ extended to us. But often people find that church is the exact opposite. It becomes a place of judgment and a place where shame is increased, not where mercy is given.
When you are loving others and you try to get to a place of compassion, right? It's kind of what you talked about when you're in a place of vulnerability. Part of that is asking yourself, why are they acting this way, et cetera, et cetera. And I think while it's a difficult thing to do, and it's another thing that cultivates practice, it's having compassion for other people. I think the humility of knowing myself allows me to offer that compassion to other people, right? That's the biggest piece of it is, you know, it's if the person is behaving this way or whatever, the church does this it's not a matter of like, I'm not taking that personally anymore. I'm able to say, that's not about me, that's about them. And not in a way like, oh, well, that's about them.
Yeah,
They're
right. That
they're
sounds
mean.
dismissive. It can't sound dismissive.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. It's more of like, well, I'm curious to know why they think that way. And then from my side, if I can have a conversation with them about why they think that way or whatever it might be, then that's great. Maybe we learn and we grow with each other, you know? If we can't, I've been able to offer that. But the difficult part about that, I think, is as far as everybody has a different perception about things. And like you said, with the verse in Genesis, walking in the garden, the way somebody reads that has so much to do with the way they view God. And that's what's happening in not just only churches, but, you know, my team, the class I coach with, that we try to create the best environment, but ultimately people are going to, you know, engage with that, you know, from their perspective. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's from their perspective. And I do think that it's important. And I think Pathfinder does a great job of communicating, acceptance. Mm. You know, Pathfinder, I think, and I've been a member for, I think 4 years now. Pathfinder, I have found is a place that really strives hard to get people connected to other people. With the small group communities that you guys do, the messages that are communicated are they're gospel centered, and they seem to reach into, and I can't quite put my finger on what it is, other than it's really good. The generational trauma, when you talk about things like those types of things get brought into it as well, and you know, I think I find that to be very, very powerful for myself. Mm. I can't speak, you know, for anybody else in terms of how to like create that environment. And I think ultimately, you know, a person you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't know, then you keep acting out of a place of not knowing. And, you know, it takes things happening in people's lives that bring them to a place where, you know, the humility is there and you want to learn and you want to know. So, yeah, I mean, I think as far as what the church can do to communicate a place of that's a place of acceptance and love is you know, what you guys have been doing. So
yeah, the power, yeah, it's and again, if you know, I guess if you don't believe in the like mastermind evil, if you don't believe in like a masterminding evil, you know, an evil that's conniving and directive, it just makes sense that if community, and specifically community built around Christ, is supposed to be the place where we experience this acceptance, this love, being known as we really are, having the grace of God extended to us, it just makes sense that would be the place that the evil one would try to turn into. Yeah. And some of it is because we're all dealing with our own shame. We don't know what to do with it. So, I mean, you can look at the church and say the church is judgmental. The best thing that probably we could all do is deal with our own shame, because if we deal with our own shame, then we don't have the judgment problem. And I think he talks about that in here too, is that judgment is driven out of our own being
we
succumbing
start
to our
doing
own
that.
shame.
Yeah, when we can't integrate. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when we're integrated, when we're dealing with our own shame, we won't be judgmental anymore
Yeah.
or as judgmental.
I wanted to say
That's how
on the
comedians
church
do
though, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut
Yeah,
you off, but
please.
I
I need to be cut
kind of
off.
hit me what is different, what I feel about the Pathfinder is I've not nothing against other churches or anything like that, but what I feel makes Pathfinder unique is the sense of intentional vulnerability that I feel when I'm here. In other words, it's not a this is where God is. This is what you should aspire to. This is all the kind of things that people associate with, I like your word, church hurt, where it's this power differential thing. And I don't think a church does that intentionally. I don't know that that's the case, but the intentional practice I feel when I'm here is the vulnerability. Hey, we're doing this together. What can we do? What are best practices? What are things that we can provide? How can we interact and engage and allow people to help people interact and engage with one another? And it really is. It's ironically, it's just kind of realizing this. It's the opposite of shame. It is an intentional vulnerability on the part of what I feel here that makes it inviting and welcoming. And I've never, you don't feel shame. You don't feel those messages, implicit or explicit, that I have felt at other, especially when I was younger, at other churches where it is the law part of it. It's the once you do this, God will, it's the opposite. It's we're all in this together. We know God loves us. Let's live a whole life. What does that look like? How can we do that? So wanted to make sure
none of us have figured out exactly what that looks like.
Exactly. We're working together. Yeah.
We're leading each other toward the goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Is there anything on your mind that's still really pertinent to this discussion that we haven't talked about yet? Or really, I know I highlighted some things in the book, but is there anything that's still kind of hanging on that you think is really important to a discussion about shame and vulnerability and being known? And he has this whole great section on, which I love as a creative, about how God's intention for us when we start working through the shame stuff is joy and creativity.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're to be co-creators with God. And so shame gets in the way of us being able to creatively, co-creatively live out our callings, our vocation. And I love that part because, as every creative knows, like there's a lot of shame in creating, but his point is like, hey, we're all creatives and that's all part of our calling. And I just found that really, really, really beautiful. Is there anything else that?
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to sum it up is I think that from Thompson's perspective and the theme of his book is we were created to create beauty with one another. God, we were created to know Christ through one another and the way we collaborate with one another. You can probably think back to the times when you really felt alive and there's a lot of synergy. It probably had something to do with an interaction you were having with somebody. And that fulfillment you felt was a part of, in order for that to occur, vulnerability has to be there. And when you're talking about a creative thing, or whether it's with your spouse or your child, there's a certain sense of vulnerability that needs to occur. And the theme of it is, we want to live in a place where we can create that beauty with other people.
Yes.
Where we can live that life of gratitude. Like I think our natural state of being is that of gratitude.
Yeah.
And
he talks about joy, gratitude,
joy.
and joy.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Like, oh, my life's so devoid of joy sometimes.
Yeah.
And maybe this is,
right. And I think that's where we're moving. That's what I took from the book is that's where I want to move to. That's the challenges I want to have is what does that look like to have that, to be vulnerable with other people and create that beauty. Mm-hmm. And that the number one challenge of that is shame. And the toughest part about shame, and Brown talks about this too. She kind of jokes about it. She's like, yeah, I'm a shame researcher. That's the fastest way to shut down a conversation on a plane. Right. It's not something that we like to either we're even aware that it's there to be dealt with, or when we become aware that we want to deal with. And And that's what I think prevents a lot of people from pursuing that. But so I would encourage others to, and I, from my own experience, it's a complete, when I'm live from a place of humility, I can put down that false self and I can be vulnerable with somebody else. And again, vulnerability can look just like listening to your daughter tell you about something, or listening to your wife tell you about how she feels about the floor not being swept. It's not anything huge, but all those little interactions are the beauty that he's talking about in that book. And I think the beauty that God wants us to create with one another, and not wants us like a legalistic, but the gift he's given us to create with one another. And that's the thing today. And everybody we meet is an absolute gift. And to experience that, it requires approaching it from a place of vulnerability. And shame wants to prevent that, so any work, any pursuit. And, you asked, like, somebody feels like they've never had these relationships before. What do they do? Going to therapy is a great place to start. It's a wonderful place to start. And I think that like, there's a lot of, I know for myself, there was a lot of time where going to therapy seemed like something was wrong with me. Shame, all that shame message just kicked in right away, and it prevented me from doing that. And then when I did start to go, the realizations that I had were phenomenal. It was just, he's a psychiatrist, right? He's writing this book. I think that's a really good place to start, is to talk to a therapist. And I see one regularly now, whether I feel like I need to or not, because it's not, I want to be physically in shape. That takes effort. That takes sometimes working with a coach, right? The mental, emotional piece of that is no different. It's no different. You find a good coach, sit down and start working through things, and you're going to find pretty quick that message of shame, and you'll be able to start working through it. So that's probably a really good place to start is with therapy. I really do think it's good, Yeah,
and there's some built-in safety there. If it's really,
that's their job, is to know how to do that. Yes, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. I don't love reading quotes, but there was this one quote near the end where Thompson says, "In any instant, it boils down to micro decisions we make that generally move us in one of two directions: a more integrated, resilient life of connection with God and others, or a more disintegrated, separated, chaotic, and rigid life. Every minute of every day, we must choose between shame and love." So he talks about love as the antithesis of shame. The affective states, he says, the two fundamental affective states warring for our souls are love and shame. And so even if shame's not a thing that's on people's minds, or they're still not sure what it is, I think it's something worth exploring. Because like I said, even after exploring it for a while, after reading this book, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is even more operative in my life than I thought, which actually isn't terrifying. It's actually really empowering, because then I can recognize it. I can see when it's getting in the way. But if it's still kind of a hard concept for you, I love the idea that these are the states we have. We have love, which is what we were created for in Genesis, and shame is the antithesis of all that. And love is creative, and love is integrated, and love is connected, and love is other-centered, and shame is disintegrated, and it's disconnected, and it's isolated, and it's accusing or blaming or judging. It's self-focused. So instead of your wife's thinking about your wife's need to have the crumbs cleaned up, it's all about my need to feel, and those are our choices. And I think there are sometimes in life we get a little reductive, and we say, well, there's two choices, and there's a million choices in life. I think this might be one of the choices where it really is.
Yep.
It's not reductive. It's real. Those are the choices that we have between those two states. And so, Brian, thanks for being a part of this conversation, and thanks for being a friend to me and joining me in my own journey of trying to heal shame, and being a safe, respectful listener, and also offering your wisdom to me and to everyone joining us today. I should say, I don't know if are you still leading our action team here at Pathfinder for The Chosen?
Yeah, we are. We're waiting for we've gone through season 4, and we're going to pick it back up when they release season 5, which I think is this spring. But yeah, absolutely, we're doing that.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
And you're a big fan of The Chosen especially for this thing. If you kind of struggle with the Bible or you struggle with the tone, like The Chosen really helps, right?
Yeah. Oh, it does. Yeah. I don't know how many times I've read the lowering of the man through the ceiling, through the roof during his thing. What does that look like?
Man,
and it's neat to see them depict what that might have looked like. And then the biblical parts are the biblical parts, and then in between there's kind of like this sermon. But it does. It really has helped me see it depicted in art. God's love, how Jesus loved others, and what that actually looked like from an artistic standpoint. I love it. It's great.
Yeah, well, thanks for leading. And any of you who are local in St. Louis, you can find any of the action teams on the Pathfinder website, including The Chosen when we get that one launched. But again, thanks, Brian.
My pleasure.
Thanks for being part of this discussion, and thank you for joining us.